Well, thank you very much. What I hope to do in the next couple of minutes is try to get you to think a little bit differently about the world that all of you have created and the responsibility that accompanies what you have wrought. I thought I would start with a couple of observations that I think are interesting. The first one is from Stuart Brand, the Whole Earth Catalog. We are as gods and we might as well get good at it. Now, there's a couple things about this that are interesting. The first is that Stuart Brand, as most of you know, is an environmentalist. And the Whole Earth Catalog had that very interesting mixture of playful technology and environmental awareness that characterized that particular era of the environmental movement. And unfortunately, it's been lost. So that the ideas and the traditions and the dialogue on environment and sustainability have moved further and further away from the ideas, the dialogue, and the issues involving technology. I will argue that that is a significant and dangerous gap for the reason that's given by the second quote. The future is already here, it's just unevenly distributed. That quote is from a guy called William Gibson. Gibson is a great person in that in 1984 he wrote a book called The Neuromancer. The Neuromancer was the basis of The Matrix, and a lot of the ideas, the conceptual flows that were developed in The Neuromancer, in fact, begin to display themselves in virtual realities like Second Life. So what he created as a pure act of science fiction, we are in the process of instantiating in our world. Now, I want to do a little experiment before I go any further. I want to divide the audience in accord with all applicable state and federal regulations into those over 40 and under 40. Over 40, I want a show of hands of how many people are familiar with Second Life. Good. Under 40, I want a show of how many people are familiar with Second Life. Okay. Over 40, how many people are not familiar with Second Life? Under 40? Interesting. That usually doesn't happen. What I want you to notice in particular is how many people in the older generation are not familiar with Second Life, which is a virtual reality environment, has been heavily covered in the media. And the reason I want you to notice that is precisely for what Gibson's talking about. The future is already here. It's just unevenly distributed. There's, for example, some very interesting things going on in Second Life with transgender, well, we'll get into that later. So that should keep you awake. That'll come in the last third of the lecture. Those of you that choose to fall asleep are going to miss that. Finally, in a little bit more playful tone, now I am become death, destroyer of worlds. Some of you will recognize that as being Vishnu, Bhagavad Gita, but it was Robert Oppenheimer who thought of those words as he watched the Trinity test in 1945. The reason that I think it's important to go back to that is that if you're looking for the tipping point when human technologies gain the power that Brand is claiming for them, that's where it started. Not because a single weapon, as dangerous and destructive as it is, made the difference, but because a nuclear winter would have an extraordinary impact on all life on this planet, unlike a lot of the things we worry about today. That, therefore, to me, becomes one of the keystone comments that over 50 years ago should have told us that this world was getting a lot more complicated than we think it is, a lot more difficult and complex than we think it is, and that we're failing to adjust to it. And that's the good news. Now, I am an academic. I'm required by the terms of my contract to do something like this at every talk. So this is from Heidegger. Heidegger, for those of you that are familiar with him, is a German metaphysician. And I like this particular quote for two reasons. The first is, it's probably the only two sentences he ever wrote that can be understood without the use of powerful pharmaceuticals, which are illegal in the state of Florida. And I want to point that out in case you wanted to further explore Heidegger. The second is, what he says, I think, captures it absolutely on point. So long as we do not, through thinking, experience what is, we can never belong to what will be. The flight into tradition out of a combination of humility and presumption can bring about nothing in itself other than self-deception and blindness in relation to the historical moment. What I am going to argue is that we have every incentive to deceive ourselves because we are unwilling, unsure, and very frightened about the responsibility that we would have if we don't fool ourselves. And we have every incentive to remain blind, and that we do so out of the best of intentions, but with the worst of effects. I want to talk about just a couple of trends that I think are important. The first is, some of you probably know this, some of you probably don't. Scientists have begun calling the current era the Anthropocene. That is, the age of humans, roughly translated. Just like the Pliocene, the Cretaceous, it's now the age of humans. They don't do so because they like that idea. Most of them, in fact, find that a particularly troubling idea. They do so because the impact of humans across natural systems is reaching the point where it becomes foolish not to realize that humans are probably the dominant factor affecting the evolution of most Earth systems. Look at the nitrogen cycle, look at the carbon cycle. Kyoto, we worry a lot about Kyoto. Kyoto is a trivial beginning first step in understanding what is actually going on the planet that we have already created. If you did everything the Kyoto Treaty asked for, you would only affect by a couple of years the peaking of carbon dioxide. It would have almost no effect. So if you think about what Kyoto would require if it were seriously implemented, and then you think about the world that we're facing, you begin to understand why for many people self-deception becomes in fact a viable strategy. Now, what are some of the things that are driving this world? There's many things, but one of the most powerful is clearly technology, especially the converging streams, nanotech, biotech, information and communication technology, cognitive science, and robotics. Those five are coming together in ways which are both unpredictable, even by people that know technology very well, and very, very potent. One of the ways to think about that is to go back and look at a previous technology, like the railroads. One of the things most people don't realize is before the railroads, every town in this country, in the UK, in Europe, had its own time. London was 4 minutes behind Reading. Comes the railroad, and you can't do that because you've got a massive technology system that has to be integrated. So what do? You come up with our standard 24-hour time around the world, regional time zones. The world wasn't born that way. That's completely arbitrary, and yet it's not arbitrary. It's a product of our technology system. If you do corporate bonds today, you're building on what railroads caused. Before railroads, people tended to own one factory, two factories. Large capitalist accumulations were not that necessary. To build railroads, you needed a lot of capital. Modern capitalism was invented on the backs of railroads. If you fly across the Midwest and you look at those patterns of land division, that just didn't happen. The Midwest was a swamp, and a very happy swamp, as far as I can tell, for millions of years. It became 1 mile by 1 mile by 1 mile because of the railroads. And the railroads put Chicago where it is. Chicago's basically a little muddy town on the edge of a swamp. It's really a bad place to be because you die because there's all kinds of mosquitoes and diseases and things like that. Come the railroads, Chicago eventually wins over St. Louis, and you get the structure of the American Midwest. It's a product of the technology. Now, that was one technology, and there's a lot of other aspects we can talk about if you're really interested in railroads. That was one technology. Look at those 5, and what you see is, in some ways, they are the accumulation of 2,500 years of history that began with the Greeks. Nanotechnology extends human cognition to the atomic level. We can design things from the atoms up. The climate change debate tells you we're designing the climate. Everybody says, oh no, I don't want to, no. Well, I mean, you can deny responsibility if you want. In fact, we're pretty good at that. But the climate is becoming a product of human activity, human design, whether you want to admit it or not. As these 5 technologies come together in their various ways, they create a technological frontier that is unique, as far as I know, in the history of our species. That has very potent and profound effects. Go back to Gibson. These are already happening. I'm not predicting science fiction. I'm telling you what's already out there that we're refusing to deal with. The world is becoming much more information dense. We'll get to some of the implications of that. You may probably be thinking other things are fairly dense at this moment. If so, please keep it to yourself. Natural systems are becoming integrated with human and built systems. Why does that matter? That matters because the dynamics of human systems are profoundly different than the dynamics of non-human systems for 2 reasons. One is reflexivity, and the other is intentionality, free will. You do not have a salt marsh turn up a Milosevic. They're not very good at it. You don't see that kind of expression of free will that takes that section of the world into major conflict. Reflexivity. Reflexivity is the process whereby when a human understands something and she explains it to other people, those other people then change their behavior. It's a very, very powerful and potent function that most people, including scientists, don't understand. How do scientists not understand it? Let's take the IPCC that just won the Nobel Prize, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So, I do a model for the IPCC. That model shows that there are going to be enormous and deleterious effects from climate change. I publish it. People respond to it by changing their behavior patterns. This is hypothetical, you understand. In doing so, they falsify my model. Because my model no longer explains the world because having put it out there, it changed behavior in such a way as to falsify its assumptions. So what does that mean? That means if I am good, I am no good. Because what's going to happen is I'm going to come up with a model, I'm going to show the results, that model is going to change people's behavior, and then they're going to tell me I did a lousy job modeling the phenomenon. That's reflexivity. Notice 2 things that does. The first thing it does is it significantly increases complexity. And the second thing it does is it significantly decreases our ability to predict what any of these systems are going to do in the future. You know that very smooth curve? I'm sure most of you know this. That very smooth curve that the IPCC has that shows how the carbon is going to climb, and that's total baloney. We don't know what the technologies are going to do, but we do know that technological surprise on the scale of decades to centuries is almost inevitable, and it always changes those kinds of smooth curves. The Club of Rome, why were they wrong? They were wrong because what they did was extend trends. And what that did was that meant they were making assumptions about what's stable and not stable. And they were wrong. On the other side, the technological optimist side, some of you are probably familiar with Kurzweil. Kurzweil predicts that within about 50 years, plus or minus, we're going to get to the point where there's a singularity. And for those of you that are interested, we're going to be able to give you virtual immortality. I don't know what virtual immortality is. I strongly suspect I'm not going to be around to see it, so I'm not sure I care that much, but I think it's a really interesting concept if you want to get wrapped around some theological issues. What it does say, though, is that Kurzweil is probably wrong in the same way that the Club of Rome is wrong, in the same way that the IPCC is wrong. That is, he is extending current trends without realizing that an extension of trends implies that you're assuming that some things are stable. And my point to you tonight is, that's wrong. What you think is stable is wrong. I don't know how. I can't tell you how. But I can tell you it's wrong. Okay, sustainability is becoming a powerful mythology. You knew that. Ethical structures. One of the problems that we've got is that we're dealing with ethical structures that are not powerful enough to manage the complexity that we have already created. Let me give you two examples. One of the questions I ask my students, which I will not ask you because it gets me in trouble, is how many innocent children you are willing to kill to save a species? And most of my students get really horrified. And then I say, okay, I'm sorry, how many species are you willing to drive to permanent extinction to save the life of a human child? And they don't tend to like that much better. But the point, of course, as you realize, is that's exactly what's going on in this world. The fact that we choose not to take ethical responsibility for it doesn't mean it's not happening. It just means we choose not to take ethical responsibility for it. Our ethics, because our ethics promote so many things to being transcendent values, it does not give us a basis to manage trade-offs among those transcendent values. That's one of the problems. Second problem is predictability. Go back to what I said about the difficulty of predicting the evolution of complex systems, particularly with this kind of technological change. Now, what are the two ways that we determine whether or not an act is good? Suppose one of you, probably get away with it at this point, there's not a jury that would convict you, got up and shot me. Okay? Boom, I die. Well, the ethics of that are pretty easy because it's a pretty simple situation. We know how to handle that. But let us say, for example, that we're talking about the ethics of how to reconstruct the Everglades and what that means. Now, there's two general approaches that ethics takes. One is utilitarian. What is the greatest good for the greatest number? That tends to be the way we do our ethics. That tends to be implicit in most government regulation. But utilitarianism fails if you don't know what the outcome of your action is going to be, because then you don't know whether somebody's benefiting or not. Do we really know that what we're doing with the Everglades is going to be in the long-term interest that we think it is? No, of course we don't. It's a very complicated system. That's why we monitor it. But it means that utilitarian values tend to fail. What are the other types of values? The other type of values goes by, you can call it Kantian ethics, you can call it tomato. You can call it values ethics. Bill Bennett calls it that. Whatever you call it, what it says is, I have a set of values, and that set of values tells me how I should act. Two problems with that. The first is those values are always simplistic. So they always fail, because it's a complicated world. I mean, look at how well we've done with the Ten Commandments, right? So that's one problem with value ethics. The other problem with value ethics is they tend to be fairly specific to a particular culture. As long as this is a Judeo-Christian world, which by and large the global culture has been, we've been able to do that and get away with it, and we think it's universal, because of course it fits with our ethical structure. What some of that Islamic pushback is all about is, that's not the only way to look at the world, dude. So, we don't have the ethical structures in place to deal with these kinds of complex problems. Okay, the only other thing that's interesting here is the idea that what we're doing is we're changing our foundational values and cultural constructs more and more rapidly because of the increasing information denseness and acceleration of information through our culture. One of the ways to think about it is this way. When Europeans first got to North America, one of the things they did was they said, okay, this is wilderness, and this is really evil. So if you go back and read the early European settlers, the way they present the wilderness is that it is evil, and the job of the Europeans is to create a garden, a managed environment. In other words, wilderness was satanic, and the effort to build a garden was doing God's work, and those are the exact words you'll find. One of the things I've found as I grow older is that when I first read that when I was in college, I kind of blew it off as being the silly way that they talked about religion back then, and they really didn't mean it. What I've come to realize is they meant it very fundamentally. No pun intended. What is wilderness now? Well, wilderness is where you go when you die if you've been good your whole life, right? And San Francisco is full. Swamp. 200 years ago, swamp was evil. And there was a good reason for that, because it killed you. The swamps around Philadelphia, Boston, Washington, you can go back and read the history, and there were major illnesses that came out of the swamps. So the swamps were evil. What are the swamps now? Well, now we call them wetlands, and you go to jail if you mess with them. Rainforests, the jungle. Europeans really hated the jungle. And this was with good reason. If you kind of like cosmic justice, it turns out that the reason Europeans hated the jungle is they would go to places that they were trying to turn into colonies, and their average lifespan was about a year because the jungle would kill them. So they hated the jungle. What is the jungle now? Well, it's a rainforest. And the image that you get is, light mist and a nice green, non-poisonous serpent kind of, it's just nice. Kind of feng shui, only with a lot of additives. What does that tell you? What that tells you is that these cultural constructs not only change over time, but they're changing more and more rapidly. Now go back to, say, the Kyoto process and look at what we're really doing. What we're really doing is we're really taking our values and saying we're going to impose them 150 or 200 years out in the future. So what we're really doing is a very interesting and subtle form of cultural imperialism, because we don't know what their values are going to be. You can't predict the future, but you do know they're going to be different. So one of the questions, one of the reasons that Heidegger got it right, one of the reasons we want to stay blind and self-deceiving is precisely because to learn how to manage, to maintain our ethical structure and our personality and our values in a world where we also must admit that those are contingent is an extremely difficult balancing act. Okay, what more good news do we have? A lot of people say, okay, well, what we need to do is we just need to control technological evolution. So we just need to make sure that we manage it properly and we'll regulate it, and that's not going to be a problem. Well, there's two problems with that. The first is most people have no idea what the technologies are actually doing. And the technologies are already ahead of anything that we're thinking about in terms of management. So that's one problem. The second problem, though, I think is a little more fundamental, and that is that the technology is being driven by forces that are very, very potent, particularly cultural competitiveness and security and national security and terrorism concerns. The kinds of technologies that we see will not come first from Coca-Cola or McDonald's. It'll be deployed first in Iraq or in trying to figure out what's happening with the containers coming into Long Beach. That's going to make it very difficult for society as a whole to have any kind of open dialogue about these technologies. An example of that came up. We had a workshop at ASU on human cognitive enhancement. And it turns out there's a lot of really socially acceptable cognitive enhancement going on right now. A case in point is, if this were a college audience and your parents weren't here, and I asked you how many of you were using Ritalin or Adderall or other drugs which help you concentrate and focus, you get a fairly significant positive response. Cognitive enhancement. It's here, it's accepted. I was talking to a professor at Stanford about that. And I said, do your students really take as much of this as I think they do? And he said, yeah. And he pulled out his bottle. Okay. So we're having a meeting on this at Arizona State. And we had people there from Sandia, National Labs. And we're all talking about cognitive enhancement, having a good time and jumping up and down and that kind of stuff, which what you do at these workshops. And one of the vice presidents from Sandia said, you know, if you can cognitively enhance, we can cognitively de-enhance. And the room got really quiet. And he said, and do you honestly think that the Russians and the Chinese, and he could have said the Americans, but he didn't, aren't researching this? And the room got really, really quiet. And that doesn't need to be nearly as weird as you think it is. You want to cognitively de-enhance the United States? Take down the internet. How much of what you do, how much of your information, how much of your memory, how much of your future plans, how much of your resources, how much of that, your social life, is already on the internet? You want to cognitively de-enhance this country? You take down the internet. That's why the Chinese are working so hard at that. First, it's asymmetric warfare. They're never going to catch most of the technologies that the US is putting out on the field. So they need asymmetric warfare. They need to figure out how to hit us in a way that makes us vulnerable. But the second is, that's a great way to cognitively de-enhance virtually the entire United States, because we all live in systems of dispersed cognitive networks. The whole lot, we think of ourselves as Cartesians, right? Oh, my entire cognition is in my brain. No, it probably wasn't to begin with, but now it's certainly not. Okay. Let me just focus on the last one. Our ignorance is profound and hidden by ideology, fundamentalism, and fear. First, most people are not willing to admit how profound their ignorance is. That's human, that's fine, but that doesn't cut it. I go into staff meetings of a bunch of professors. Chaos is what I go into. And we're talking about the students we're getting. And the students we're getting, many of them are wired. They've been growing up with the internet. They Google. I go into my class, half of the notebooks flip up and they're on Google. Some professors don't allow that. I think that's kind of like teaching math and not allowing calculators. It keeps me on my toes. Why? Because they have access to more facts than I will ever even know exist. If I teach them facts, I am obsolete. Most professors are obsolete. What I need to be teaching them is I need to be teaching them about thinking patterns. More subtly, I need to be teaching them how to navigate virtual realities. And what am I teaching them? Facts? It's ridiculous. So what that tells you is that we have serious problems in admitting the depths of our ignorance. Ideology, fundamentalism, and fear. Fundamentalism is a very interesting phenomenon, particularly in this country. Contrary to what most people think, religion and science have not been at each other's throats for hundreds and hundreds of years. It's a fairly modern phenomenon. And what's really interesting is you'll notice that the dialogue does not consist of theological discussions. The theology behind fundamentalism is very light. The fear and concern behind fundamentalism is very real and very powerful. Why? Think about what technology has done over the past 20 or 30 years. Think about the social change that it has engendered. Think about the difficulty of trying to keep up with what's happening in technology and science if you have less than a high school education. And then try to think about what your only possible response is if you want to maintain your psychological stability. It's to react against modernity. Notice also that fundamentalism is not a phenomenon only of, say, American Christianity or of Islam. It's in essentially all religions are seeing a strengthening of fundamentalism, as is environmentalism. Environmentalism, in the sense of the sacred being in nature, is very close to, if not a theology. And if you talk to a lot of people in Europe, you see that fundamentalism coming up in environmentalism. Why? Because it's a defense. It's a defense against somebody coming up to you and saying, everything that you thought you knew is wrong. What are you going to do about it? And your response is fire and brimstone. Rapture, baby. Okay, so what are some of the key concepts? The first is that Earth systems extend across science, technology, human systems, and natural systems. We persist in looking at these things as if they're separate. They're not. So we come up with a policy that says, yeah, let's make ethanol out of corn. That sounds like a real good idea. This is not what I would say, by the way, if I were in Iowa or Kansas. Aggressive I may be, stupid I'm not. So what do? We start making it out of ethanol. What do we know? We know first that that's not a very intelligent way to make energy. But the second thing that we apparently overlooked completely is the fact if you take a major food grain and start really driving up demand, it's going to ripple across the food system of the entire globe. Why do we miss things like that? We miss things like that, first, because the politics help us not look at it, but secondly, because we don't know how to think about Earth systems. Complexity, complexity, complexity. We really do not like complexity. We really have to learn to live with it. Because, folks, if we didn't like complexity and we didn't want to live in a world where we should have stopped before the Industrial Revolution. We didn't, and it's here. Deal with it. Mutually exclusive but equally valid ontologies. This is a problem. What this says is you have to be able to understand that for you there is an absolute position that is right, that grounds you, that gives you your moral authority and makes you what you are, and at the same time understand that somebody who's completely different is just as valid. That's extraordinarily difficult. Most people think that leads to relativism. I don't think it has to. We can talk about that later if you want. The world is design space. There's a technology they're working on in Tucson. This technology would take carbon dioxide directly from the atmosphere, and you could then liquefy it or make it supercritical, whichever, and inject it into underground aquifers. So what does that tell you? Cost, say, $80 to $240 a ton. What that tells you is, first, that climate change is a choice. It's not an existential crisis we can't avoid. It's a choice. We can stop it if we want. We simply have to invest in a technology like that. We choose not to. How many coal plants are we putting up without sequestration? We talk as if climate change mattered. Look at the money and it doesn't matter. That's very important. The other question that kicks up is more fundamental. So I'm working on climate change. What is my answer right now? My answer right now is I'm going to stop driving and we're going to cut emissions by 90%. Well, God bless if you think that. And whatever it is that you're smoking, I'd like some too after this is over. That's not going to happen. China and India are both industrializing very rapidly. The idea that we are going to have some kind of dramatic, immediate cut in CO2 emissions is not going to happen. So, what that tells you is that we're up against another question. Let's say I go to this technology that pulls carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. Suddenly, I have a much, much more complex policy issue, right? Because my policy on the one hand is, let's just stop doing what we're doing. And it's a great policy. It's very romantic, but I don't think it has a very high chance of success. But if I start pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, the first question I'm going to come back at all of you with is, what kind of world do you want? You want 280 parts per million CO2 equivalent? That's a little low. You'll remember in 1970, Newsweek had glaciers coming down on New York City. Most of the Boston fans thought that was a great idea. I can give you 280. You want 360? We're at about 360 now. It's a little bit higher. But I can give you 360. It's not a bad world. It's a pretty good atmosphere. I think you'll like it. You want 480? If you're Russia or Canada, you might seriously think about 480 because it'll open up a lot of resources that you haven't been able to take advantage of. A little tough if you're a South Sea island, but you can't outvote the Russians. So what do you want? Now notice the difference. The difference is between taking a fairly romantic position that's impractical but makes me feel good about myself, and a position that instead comes back at you and says, all right, what kind of world do you want? You make a moral decision about what kind of world you want, because that's what my technology is giving you. And you can't worm out of it anymore. Profoundly different questions. The human is becoming a design space. For those of you that have been attending these lectures or talking to Ken, you know exactly what that means. Case in point, leave aside the internet example, which is my favorite because it involves my students and it allows me to tease other professors. Look at the technology we're developing that will enable us to embed a wireless transmitter in your brain and allow you to be able to control your environment wirelessly. We've done this with monkeys. Most of you have probably heard of that experiment. What they did was they put a wireless transmitter in the monkey, they put an arm over there that was hooked up to the wireless transmitter, and the monkey learned by thinking alone to move the arm in the other room. One of the most dazzling pictures I've ever seen in science is the morning they walked in to the laboratory, and the monkey has so far been moving all three of its arms, right? And they walk into the laboratory one morning, and the monkey's hanging out like he's in the 64 GTO cruising the strip. I mean, he does have his arm just sort of hanging out like this. And the other arm is going up and down and earning the monkey food. The monkey has learned that that arm is an independent part of his body. And then, of course, this is Duke. They send it up to MIT. The monkey doesn't give a flip, right? Want me to move the arm in MIT? Sure, I'll move the arm in MIT. Feed me. Now, that's what is public. What is public is also that there's a number of firms that are commercializing technology for severely paralyzed individuals who will be able to manipulate their environment using this technology. What's not so public is what happens if you start hooking up major weapon systems to that kind of technology in the future. Where does the human begin? Where does the machine stop? The image that we have is, coming out of movies like The Matrix, it's going to be the humans against the machine. I don't think that's the way it's going to work. Every indication we have is that it's the humans integrating into the machine and that we're already well into that process. I did a talk on transhumanism a week ago at Arizona for the Templeton Foundation, actually. And one of the things that I realized as I went through the case studies in that talk is that we're already transhuman. That Ritalin, the drugs, our athletes, the way we integrate into the internet, the technologies we're building, we're already transhuman. The reason we don't see it is that we think of transhuman as meaning we're going to be half cyborg. And that's not the way it happened, with a whimper, not a bang. All right, I'm going to end with one example, which I think is kind of fun. If you think the rest of this has been fun, which you may or may not. And that is the Autonomic City. Now, one of the things, those of you that are engineers know that one of the things that we're doing for a number of very good reasons is we're building information structures, sensor systems, control systems into virtually every level of the urban landscape. We're creating intelligent materials so that we can understand when it begins to fail. We're creating intelligent buildings because it's green and you get sustainability points for doing it. And besides, if you're an engineer, it's kind of cool. We're creating intelligent infrastructure, and overall, we're overlaying an information system increasingly hooked up to the net. Now, that's fine, but the other side of that equation is that information systems are changing profoundly. When I was with AT&T and we were running a telephone network, the information system, the virtual and the real, were the same thing. I mean, you had wires, the wires were real, you didn't have a virtual network. Now what we've done is we've platformed virtuality on top of a number of different physical networks. And you have a virtual network that's what they call autonomic. Autonomic means it's self-creating, self-engineering, self-designing, self-diagnosing, self-healing, and at least in some cases, we're beginning to build primitive learning capabilities into it. Now, I just want you to think about those two trends coming together. And we've already mentioned how that dramatically oversimplifies the issue. You've got more and more information going into the city structure, the urban structure, and you're building all of this enhanced functionality into information systems at every level. AT&T's building it into its network, IBM's building it into its computer systems, Intel's building it into its chips. So all of this begins to come together, and it comes together in the Autonomic City. One of the reasons I'm concerned is if you go back to October 19, 1987, Black Monday, Dow Jones dropped 22%. If you look at the financial basics, there really wasn't a good reason for that. It just felt like doing it, and it did it. One reason was that more and more people were going to automated trading systems. That is, the computer was doing the trade. The computer systems were all designed to begin selling at a certain point because you want to cut your losses. Now, every firm that was doing this was doing it independently, but you begin to see what the system's effects were. The system effect was, as the market began to collapse, once it passed a certain threshold, these programs begin to cut in, and it creates a very powerful feedback loop. And you got 22% out the bottom of Dow Jones. Now, remember that this is money, right? People care about this. So they were paying attention to this stuff. I got to tell you, not many people care about the infrastructure of most cities. So what's going to happen is we build all of this information structure into a city, and we build intelligence into those information structures, and we just let it run. Nobody's got a clue. But you know what? That's what we're doing. There's not a city in the country that isn't working on some of these systems. So that's just an example. I didn't want you to go away feeling too optimistic. And I want to leave you with this thought. This is not about what we are going to do. This is about what we have already done. So this is not about trying to understand something that may or may not happen in the future. This is about our ethical responsibility for the world that we have created and are living in now. And I take you back to Heidegger, and I suggest we have two choices. One is Heidegger, and the other is to take responsibility for that we're doing, to try to understand it, and to try to do it better. So far, we seem to be choosing the first. Thank you very much. And I'll take a couple of questions. Yeah, so. Just a question. Please speak into the mic, because.
Yeah, just a quick question. In terms of energy systems, there has been a very small increase in line carrying capacity for electrical systems, yet the demand has skyrocketed. How would this be related to this autonomic approach?
It's not my area of expertise, but I know that people are trying to build in information structures into electric systems for a number of reasons, including the fact that because of the system design, you can have a small problem in an electrical system that begins to build and cascade. And one of the ways to try to avoid that is to build in information systems that can see that happening and then implement cutoff technology, that sort of thing. I really don't know enough to answer more than that, except to say that one of the things that's very important about these systems is to understand when we're enhancing our resilience and when we're enhancing our vulnerability. That's particularly important with a foundational system like electricity, and I haven't seen a lot of work on that, at least in the resilience literature. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
In the late 70s, early 80s, when we first started looking at genetic engineering and cloning, at that point, it was mainly driven by money. And So instead of it being a study for truth that generally you would think of in science, that failed, and because our ethics we weren't ready to face it even then, and it's probably worse now.
Yeah, that's a very good example, in fact. Think about how many people here think there's a crisis in biodiversity? How many? Crisis in biodiversity. One of the theories that is beginning to go around, which ties into what you just said, is that in fact there's not a crisis, there's a cusp. That we're moving from evolved biodiversity to designed biodiversity, synthetic biology, or what they call at MIT plug-and-play biology. So what they do at MIT, for example, is they have a metabolic pathway that a couple of grad students decided to plug into an E. coli because E. coli smell pretty bad, if you've ever worked with them. Well, all of you have, but not scientifically. And so they made the E. coli smell like bananas. The argument is that if you look at it from an informational viewpoint, and it's not clear what that means, that we're not in a crisis of biodiversity, we're in a cusp. The reason this is important is because if you don't understand that may be happening, what you don't understand is there are very different drivers between evolved biodiversity and designed biodiversity. Evolved biodiversity tends to evolve in the context of a community where stability is an important characteristic. Designed biodiversity is designed primarily for commerce. Well, or at MIT for fun, but that is even more problematic. So as we design humans, one of the things, or biology as a whole, one of the things we have to understand is that the drivers behind the design are going to be very different. Whatever humans are now is a process of a whole lot of things, but one of them has not been deliberate design for economic efficiency. What is liable to happen in the future, and what in fact you could argue the digital native, digital immigrant break is about. That is, kids that grow up native to the information systems are wired differently and are much more capable with them than people like me. What that's about, in some ways, is designing people to be optimally efficient in a very complex, high information input-output environment. So in some ways, we're already designing humans, and we're designing them precisely for the reasons you say. Thank you. Good comment. Let's see, one there and then one there, if we can do that.
Given the complexity of this culture that you're describing, and you're talking about concepts and abstractions that some of us can barely grasp, where do we look for leadership in navigating the world the way it is today? Do we look to academicians?
Oh,
do
God,
we look
no.
to philosophers? To politicians? Where do we get some help in navigating?
I think that at this point, one of the things, there's a couple principles that I think you can follow that help, but they're not easy ones. The first principle is that which you most believe, you must distrust the most. Because I really think what misleads us in trying to understand the world that we're a part of is the fact that we tend to bring to that job obsolete belief systems and obsolete ideologies that really get in our way of seeing the world as it is. I almost never get to the point where I try to make value decisions about the things I see. For the most part, I don't like it. I think there's a lot of potential for serious problems, and I don't necessarily like the world I see. But to maintain integrity, you've got to try to understand the world the way it actually is. And for most of us, even doing that is very, very difficult. Because I think that's so important, I think you have to avoid authority. Because most authority believes their own PR one way or another. And they're wrong. Because what they're doing then is they're embedding obsolete ideas and worldviews and values in ways which preclude them from understanding the world they're part of. So in some ways, this has to be an individual responsibility. I know that's not a good answer, but I don't trust anybody. I particularly don't trust myself, but that's a separate issue. Now, one here, and then there was a woman back there who has been waiting patiently.
Do you think that designed diversity, or not natural diversity, but the way we would change things ourselves, is going to lead to a reduction in resilience over time unless science can keep up with it, in which case we might get a bubble that we can't answer?
Excellent. Yeah, one of the problems, I mean, particularly when I talk to conservation biologists, the response to observing that you may be moving to a different regime of biodiversity is so difficult for them to accept that basically that's as far as we get and it never gets beyond there. But notice the question that the gentleman just raised. If you don't accept that as at least a possible scenario, you never ask the question of, well, is this making for a much more fragile biodiversity than if I have evolved biodiversity? I think clearly there's that potential, because when you design something for economic purposes, you design it for efficiency of throughput. And there's no guarantee that that particular kind of biological structure, taken as a whole, is going to be anything but very fragile in the face of unpredicted upsets. So I think that's a very serious problem, and I think it's one that needs to be looked at. But notice you don't get there until you accept the possibility of designed biodiversity. Yes, ma'am.
Hi.
Hello.
Those two questions, I don't even know how to ask my question. I feel it's very important, but you've covered so much and you're so vast about it. It's overwhelming. I want to come take a class. But your comments about, this invisible intuition, which the natural world seems to run with, that we, knowing my own incapabilities to make one decision and not turn around and go, well, that wasn't right. Wrong about coffee, much less is it good for you, is it bad for you, much less the detailed things you're talking about. And the answer coming up to, well, it is up to me. It is my own intuition that tells me what I need to do to understand anything or let go of judgment or make the decision I have to make in the moment. And a lot of this comes around to me to what is the kernel that would make a species try to destroy everything it approaches. That's part of my belief system. You would probably tell me to let go of. And a lot of it, to me, seems to stem from that internal intuition. We grow according to listening to ourselves, which is a problem, and overpopulation. And I'd love to hear what you have to say about intuition, invisible force, and overpopulation.
Let me give you two things. And the cosmos.
Talk about God.
The first is that I think that there's one characteristic of the human species that we seem to be very unwilling to accept, but that to me seems to be blindingly clear. And that is, think about the one characteristic you would expect a species to have if it grows to dominate a planet. And that's where we are. It's the will to power. I mean, don't kid yourselves, right? It's the will to power. That, however, is not necessarily a bad thing. One of the things that I think we should not lose sight of is that the technologies, the things that we've created are extraordinary. And they're extraordinary in ways that we should be very respectful of. I mean, the internet, I am in awe of the internet. What the internet does in terms of making information available to even mediocre students is absolutely extraordinary. What it does in terms of functionality, in terms of enriching lives. Second Life is a virtual world. Most adults think that means it's just a playground. There's an island in Second Life that was created. You can't get to it unless you have the passcodes, but it was created as a refuge for battered children in Bulgaria. It's the one place on Earth, or out of Earth, it's the one place they can go and feel safe. That's extraordinary. There's another island in Second Life. We just had the Chief Technical Officer of Second Life at ASU for a while. There's another island in Second Life that was built by stroke patients specifically to help other stroke patients recover from strokes. There is real beauty in these human creations. I think that whether or not you view it as in the end good, first it depends on what happens from here on out, and I haven't a clue. But it also depends on what your teleology is, what your belief about what the appropriate endpoint of human activities is. A lot of teleologies tend to focus on an Edenic vision. I mean, how many people here have ever bought a Sierra Club calendar that had the 12 most beautiful pictures of inner cities on it? And yet, where do most people live? So there's a very powerful Edenic teleology that many of us carry within us. If your idea is Edenic, then probably this world is not going to be a happy one. There's also a teleology, though, of New Jerusalem. That is to say that humans, through their activity, through their technology, through their ethical behavior, demonstrate themselves worthy to be saved. That actually has driven a lot of Western technological evolution. So there's another teleology. So what you believe about the appropriateness of this world probably has a lot to do with your teleology. But I would even back up a step before that and say, before you even get there, you got to figure out the world you're actually living in. You got to go out and find Gibson's pieces of the future that are already here and lying around. Places like Second Life. Things like the implantable chip. Things like the work they're doing at Boise State, where they're figuring out they're looking for DNA sequences that are so inimical to life that to have that DNA sequence is to die. Now, why in God's name they were allowed to publish that in the open press, I don't know. But it's in the open press, and they're actually looking for it. And it makes sense when you think about it. We're coming up with all of these genetic strings. What about the ones that are immediately terminal? Whoa. So it depends on how you look at the world. That's not a very satisfactory answer, but it's the best I can give.